Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to talk about a book that has kind of ended up sort of sweeping so many awards already this year. And at the time of filming, we haven't yet had the Booker long list for this year, but I would not be surprised in the slightest to see this book make it. And that is Praiseworthy by Alexis Wright. Please excuse how grubby my copy of this book is, partly because of the length of this book. It's a casual 700 pages. It lived in my bag for quite a long time and kept on sort of just, as things fell into my bag or sort of spilled, just kept on picking up stains. Anyway, all of that's irrelevant. I think this book is extraordinary in so many ways. It's a book that has really challenged me in many ways. Just it sort of is nothing like nothing else really I've ever read. And so I'm going to try and attempt to talk a little bit about this book. There will be some spoilers potentially later. I'll try and keep it as spoiler free as possible, and I'll announce when that's the case. But it's worth sort of noting at the beginning, before I start all of this, look, I'm no expert in Australian and Aboriginal history or kind of ongoing current politics, which this book engages with a lot. So if I do make any mistakes on that, please feel free to pick me up on it. But I think, if nothing else, it's just really exciting to see a book that deals so much within a kind of an Aboriginal lens on the world and through an indie publisher, at least in the UK, just really take sort of prizes and various other things by storm. It's an incredible book in many, many ways, and I'm very excited to talk about it. So let's get started. So the core idea of Praiseworthy is that we are following a set of people in a town called Praiseworthy as they deal with essentially some fairly dramatic world events, or what they see as potentially coming. So right at the beginning, there is a cloud that sort of appears above, it just appears in the sky above the people of Praiseworthy. And some people see this as being part of environmental collapse, or kind of a sign about what's happening in the climate. Others see it as being sort of something quite prophetic, that sort of speaks to potentially a giant change or something more spiritual going on. And particularly, this book then engages with that on several different notes, how sort of particularly sort of white Australians might look at this more from the lens of climate change, and how some of the Aboriginal people in the town see this as a sort of a sign of something else instead. And what really starts to happen is this book diverts into these various different sort of narratives that are incredibly dense and lyrical and thoughtful and clever, but also really overwhelming. This is a book that is a really unique reading experience, I think. Something I've said sort of before when I've been talking about it is this book, to some degree, creates its own language and then just kind of iterates on that as it goes. And although that sounds, hopefully it doesn't sound too off-putting, but what I mean by that is characters gain names, and then those names are used as if that is a name that we're used to, and then it builds and something else gets added or changed, and this just keeps building. It's sort of a snowball of a novel. It starts from this one point of this big event, and it just keeps building in the most sort of almost absurd ways at times, but in a way that I thought was utterly engaging. So, for example, one of the characters in this book sees this cloud and starts to see that it is going to be a way for essentially sort of Aboriginal people to rise again. But equally, some other people around him see it as a way of taking out some of that sort of political power for Aboriginal people. So they speak about it as if basically, I'm trying to do this without really spoiling too much. Essentially, part of one of the core ideas from one of the characters is that this is a way of absolving things, and essentially it kind of goes really to almost a very dark place of an idea that all Aboriginal, First Nations, Indigenous people, particularly in the Torres Island Strait, are basically basically murderers and criminals and all these other things. It kind of starts from this place and basically almost absorbing the political language that's often used against Aboriginal and First Nations and Indigenous people, not only in Australia, but kind of across the world, and kind of flips it, because what it sort of seems to suggest is this person has absorbed all of this narrative and wants to flip it back now and wield it against other Aboriginal people and almost cleanse the country of those people. This is obviously incredibly dark and twisted, and it is something that hits incredibly uncomfortably throughout this book, but I think is a really bold move of Alexis Wright as the author to essentially take what is so painful, you know, this repeated narrative of people being murderers and criminals and whatever, and look at the psychological effect that can have on the people who belong within that group, to the point where they start to internalize it and start to police it in others. And that in many ways speaks to a lot of what you see in sort of a lot of, I can't speak for Australia, but a lot of wider political discourse of people of a marginalized group who start to sort of see that their way out of being marginalized is to wield the same weapons as the people who are against them, to kind of have the same talking points, to really be able to speak about some of these same things, and therefore to create themselves as the good version of that, you know. Complete side point, but I've seen people do this, you know, as a gay man, I've seen people, other gay men do this as a way of sort of wielding it as a weapon to sort of say, oh, I'm gay, but I'm not like them. I'm one of the good gays, you know. And in some ways it feels like a similar narrative that Alexis Wright is playing with here, of taking this character and absorb, like, kind of looking at how those messages can be absorbed, and somebody would want to, you know, an Aboriginal character would want to become white in this sort of sense in Australia to wield power. And it's a really daring and really bold move. And I'm sure there are wider references going on within that reference Australian and Aboriginal history and politics that I'm missing entirely, not being from there and not being surrounded by it. But I just think that's a really bold move. And in many ways, that gives you a flavour for what this book is like. We have another character who wants to, whose name is Aboriginal Sovereignty, and they want to take their own life to kind of forward their kind of purpose as well. And this is established quite early in the book. And again, this sets up this idea of almost political messages becoming real, becoming, you know, moving from just being something verbal or something written down into a physical manifestation in a character, in a person who is now seeking to do this. And the wider political idea that somebody called Aboriginal sovereignty would want to take their life suggests also something about the kind of politics of that, of, is this Aboriginal sovereignty trying to, you know, is this sort of the death knell for Aboriginal sovereignty as a concept, as an idea? And actually, there's something really interesting within that of a recent Australian vote, where there was recently, and again, I don't know all the details of this, but there was recently a referendum in Australia about the next steps for granting more sovereignty and political power to Aboriginal peoples. And it was a vote that failed. It didn't pass. And, you know, this is a vote that is being voted on by many, you know, the vast majority of people who are going to be voting on this are people who are not within the community. You know, they're not Aboriginal, they're not First Nations or Indigenous. And interestingly, this was also something that came out in wider Australian politics, where occasionally Aboriginal or First Nations, Indigenous politicians or public figures would speak out against this vote, saying we shouldn't vote for it because of X, Y, Z. And I think in some ways, Alexis Wright is satirizing them. Whether that had happened, I mean, I'm guessing the bulk of this book was written before that maybe happened, but those figures would have existed in wider Australian history and politics before. So there's something really fascinating about this, the way the book engages with those types. You know, in some ways, these main characters are ciphers for much bigger political conversations. And I think it's absolutely fascinating the way this does it. I realize I'm not even going into spoilers by doing most of this. This all happens very early, that we have these conversations in the book, and it appears in the blurb and various other things. We also have characters who are, to some degree, more the signs of the sort of the spiritual world for Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nations people. And they as well sort of speak to this kind of idea of a lineage and a history. But this is where the book, I think, is just so fascinating, because we have almost these different perspectives of indigeneity and First Nation status, and where those people might differ in views. And all of these play out in this very sort of fantastical, almost magical style of world, but we know that there's a real true brutality hiding beneath it. And I think that's what's really the absolute power and beauty of this book, is it does something really quite clever to investigate some of the scariest parts of the political sphere, of day-to-day life, of wider kind of people power, or even kind of this sort of, following the leader kind of herd mentality. And it plays it out in a small town as a sort of microcosm. But we know, as this book is going on, that this is talking about something much broader. We know that this is talking about, in many ways, even broader than Australia. It seems to sort of have a global resonance of talking about the ways that political discourse has become so fractured and so polarized, that we could have characters like both Tommy Hawk, the one who wants to become white, and Aboriginal sovereignty, his brother who wants to take his own life. All of those characters is just really, all of these characters to some degree speak to this wider polarization of politics, that it is possible to have people on such extreme ends of a divide and of a conversation that they can both coexist within a political sphere and both pick up supporters and followers and kind of all of these sorts of things. And that's not even really to talk about other aspects of this book. These are just sort of two main characters, but there's so much more going on in this book. I genuinely feel that this is a book that PhDs will be written about for years to come. It's so dense and thought through and intelligent and daring, and it just keeps moving. It's got so much going on, and all of this, I realize, makes it sound like an incredibly intimidating read, and to some degree the length and the kind of topic would suggest that. But I also found something so utterly beautiful about the writing style of this. It's deeply lyrical and thoughtful. And the really great thing with And Other Stories, the publisher of this, is that they put the first few lines of the book on the front cover. And it gives you a sense of just the intensity of this book, but also its beautiful lyricism. And I'll just read from that front bit here. Once upon a fine time for some people in the world, but not so plenteous nor perfect for others, there lived a culture dreamer obsessing about the era. He was no great dreamer, no greater than the rest of the juggernauts in his heartbroken, storm country people's humanity. They knew just as much as he did about surviving on a daily basis, and about how to make sacrifices of themselves in all the cataclysmic times generated by the mangy dogs who had stolen their traditional land. And in many ways, that is such a perfect introduction to the rest of what this book is going to be about. It is beautifully lyrical, whilst also being completely unsparing about various groups and communities. Nobody really comes out of this book in a, kind of smelling of roses. This book is very content to interrogate absolutely everything and everyone. And I think that's its real power. I think this book is absolutely stunning for just being an absolutely bold, unflinching, unceasing look at the world through a very specific lens and a very specific story. But I think it unravels something truly universal and deeply clever and beautiful in the midst. And like I said, this book builds and creates its own language. The kinds of sentences you're seeing on page 400 or 500 to some degree feel different from the ones you could have had in the first 100 pages, because the language itself is starting to build. We've got characters whose names expand, or where things change in the way that this language is being done. And I think that's what's so exciting about this book. It's utterly inventive and thoughtful. I just love it. I'm fairly sure I've probably only understood about a quarter of this book, and yet I still think it's exceptional, because I think there is so much in this book that several careful reads would, and a PhD would probably still not fully be able to investigate. I think that's what's beautiful about it. So anyway, I'll leave it there. As you can tell, I kind of liked it. I thought it was pretty great. I've been Bob the Booker talking about this book. I'd love to hear thoughts and comments below, particularly if I've either got any details wrong or sort of other wider thoughts, because I think there's so much to discuss within this book, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Anyway, I've been Bob the Booker. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.